Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. Now, my previous one was Erik Karlsson, who was far and away the highest graded player on the Sharks roster, and to the surprise of nobody ever since the trade of Timo Meier. But when you look past Erik Karlsson, nobody else on the San Jose Sharks roster necessarily had a great season. There were some good seasons, so there are definitely some players who you could say are relatively close to being the second highest rated, but definitely nobody else who makes this an obvious decision. And so after evaluating a couple of other choices, I decided to settle on the Sharks captain, Logan Couture. And remember, it should be noted that when I say the second highest rated player, I don't necessarily mean the Sharks' second best player of this past season. I mean the player who was the second most sort of outperforming of expectations, like how Karlsson was outperforming the expectations the most out of any Sharks player. Now, when it comes to Logan Couture, he's had a pretty interesting career. He's been with the San Jose Sharks for the entire time, drafted by the team as well. And while he has always been a very good player for San Jose, during the regular season, he's never really been the first player you think of when you think of the Sharks. During the early 2010s, when he originally made his debut, while he did end up being a Calder finalist in his rookie season, you always thought of, Joe Thornton, Patrick Marleau, Dan Boyle in those early parts of that decade. As the time would wear on, the Sharks would add Brent Burns, Joe Pavelski would really come into his own, Tomas Hertl would really pan out as a strong rookie, Timo Meier eventually, then there's the acquisition of Evander Kane, the acquisition of Erik Karlsson, and so over these many years, Logan Couture had always been a top player for the Sharks, but usually like the third best or the fourth best, at least all this being said during the regular season, because during that regular season, those 82 games, Logan Couture would play a good style of game, but maybe like 70 to 80% of his expected level. It was always during the playoffs that Logan Couture would raise his game not just to a 100% capability, but to the 110% effort that he would always put in. When the Sharks would make an impact in the playoffs, Logan Couture was usually that driving force, or at least a major driving force in that. Taking a look at the years that the Sharks have made the playoffs since Logan Couture has been on the team, 6 times they've managed to get past the first round, and in 4 of those 6 times, Logan Couture has been a point per game player. The only 2 times he hasn't is his first 2 years in the NHL, and even that includes an 18-game performance where he put up 14 points. But in 4 of the other 6, he was a point per game, and that has sort of lost its luster a bit over these past couple of seasons because so many players, because of scoring being so up, so many players have been able to get to that point per game mark. But, a few years ago, this used to be a pretty big rarity to be able to be a point per game player. It used to mean you were very, very, very good. And then on top of that, doing that in the playoffs where scoring is generally down because teams play a tighter game and there's less power plays and all of that is even more impressive. And yet Logan Couture would always manage to have this type of performance. An incredible player. Everyone will remember his 15-16 run where he seemed to be a lock for the Conn Smythe had the Sharks actually managed to defeat the Pittsburgh Penguins in that Stanley Cup Finals. And so while regular season was never Logan Couture's forte, the playoffs was always where he shined, which does hurt him over these past 4 seasons where the Sharks have missed the playoffs. You see, with the time in which most people think back of the players on the team is usually during the off season. And of course, when you think back in the off season of a year where you made the playoffs, you're thinking back at playoff performances, and so strong player performances make you think back on a player who had a strong general year, even if their regular season was relatively weak. So usually when you thought back of Couture's season, you would say he had a great year. But over these past 4 seasons of missing the playoffs, you can only really think back to the regular season where Couture has never necessarily shined all that much. And so it has certainly hurt his stock in the hockey world, so to speak, where he has gone from being in that conversation for one of at least the better centers in the league to now not even necessarily being in the conversation for a top 32 center, as he's fallen to maybe being even behind Tomas Hertl in the center depth chart on the San Jose Sharks. Having said all of that, Couture's still a very effective player for the San Jose Sharks, and this season was a nice uptick in terms of offense for him as we take a look at his stats. 82 games played, 27 goals, 40 assists, and 67 points. So notably, like Erik Karlsson before him, he actually played the entirety of the season, which is actually somewhat of a rarity for Logan Couture, not necessarily known as an injury prone player, because it's never necessarily keeping him out for an extended period of time, and he's always there for the playoffs and all of those things. But there have been a lot of seasons in the past where he's missed at least a small handful of games, so seeing him play a full 82 is nice. 27 goals, quite good, 40 assists for the 67 points, and like I said, he's been good in the regular season, but never great, and so this 67 points actually ties a career high for him. Now, honestly, 67 points in the current year NHL, where scoring is much higher, is not as impressive as when he last scored 67 points a few years ago, but still, career high. And it is sort of balanced out by the fact that he was playing with some lesser line mates, I would say, this past season. In fact, more than 25% of his even strength ice time was spent on a line with Barabanov, who is quite good, but also Matt Nieto, who doesn't necessarily scream top six forward, second line player at all. And so Logan Couture, you could say his offense was slightly muted because of that. On the other hand, you could say his offense, and this is where the balance comes in, you could say his offense was propped up by the outstanding season of Erik Karlsson. Karlsson was so good that it essentially just warped the offensive outputs of pretty much every other player on the team. Now, usually, at least during the earlier parts of the season, many of those insane plays that Karlsson would set up would lead to Timo Meier goals. But Logan Couture was probably the second most likely beneficiary of those Erik Karlsson situations, and so his point totals, you could say, are somewhat inflated because of that. But in the end, at the end of the day, it is a 67-point season for a second-line center for the San Jose Sharks, who's used in slightly more of a defensive role compared to an offensive role, so still rather solid. That does bring me to the plus-minus rating. I mentioned in Erik Karlsson's video how the plus-minus could be somewhat misleading, I guess you could say, but many people regard Erik Karlsson as a pretty bad defenseman in the league. Some will say he's at least average, but many on the worst side of the opinions will say he's really bad. But on the other hand, Logan Couture, many regard him as a very strong defensive forward, or at least pretty good, and so seeing him as a minus 30 may come as a surprise to many. Well, the same reasons remain for why plus-minus is a flawed stat compared to Erik Karlsson still. As, of course, in this situation, we see that the Sharks are a very bad team. They've given up 21 empty net goals against, which are a minus 21. The Logan Couture is almost certainly on the ice for the vast majority of those. But on top of that, Logan Couture also ends up starting a lot of his shifts in the defensive zone compared to many. He is relied on defensively compared to other forwards on this team. So, for instance, if we take a look at the other top six center for the San Jose Sharks, Tomas Hertl, only 24% of his faceoffs that he has taken this season have occurred in the defensive zone, compared to Logan Couture, where 42% of his faceoffs, almost half of his faceoffs, have started in the defensive zone. So David Quinn, even though this is his first season as Sharks head coach, immediately recognizes that Logan Couture is the more reliable defensive option for this team, and so a lot of the times he is the one facing off against the other team's top competition. And considering the Sharks are one of the worst teams in the league, their goaltending is absolutely awful. Even if Logan Couture is doing a decent job defensively in the defensive zone, you're going to give up goals and you're going to rack up that minus. So I wouldn't think too bad about this situation. And then when it comes to the time on ice, over 19 minutes of ice time, this is technically an increase over last year, but not by a notable amount like it was with Erik Karlsson, about 20 seconds or so, or 10 to 15 seconds, I should say, more. This is one of his highest ice times over the last few years, but again, not by that notable of amount. So it's just generally a situation where Couture, he plays in all situations. He's still a top six forward, and in a situation where the Sharks do lack many top six forwards, and so he's going to get a good amount of ice time. And then when we take a look at his grade, this is not something I did with Erik Karlsson, but I will do with future reviews, is that I'll take a look at what the grade I gave them was last year, and last year I ended up giving Logan Couture the grade of a B, which is generally that he outperformed my expectations by a decent amount, but wasn't necessarily amazing. And my grade for this year is a very very, very similar B as well. This is because while his offensive output is up, how much of that is necessarily contributed to him, how much of that is necessarily contributed to other factors like Erik Karlsson being amazing and putting up 101 points. His defensive game is somewhat difficult to review because the Sharks generally are a terrible team and their goaltending was really, really bad. But he himself, minus 30 is definitely the worst of his career by a very wide margin. So there's definitely some factors there. So generally, I would say he had a good season, but nothing amazing, which does give him that grade of a B. Class dismissed.